the idea behind policy dialogues was that research evidence is one key input into the process, but we really need a mechanism of capturing people's tacit knowledge, their real-world views and experiences on the issue. And we really need that on all of the things that evidence can't really give us insights about. So that's, what are the institutional constraints that policymakers and stakeholders are working under? What are the interest group pressures they're having to contend with? What are the values that they want to see driving decision making? What are all the other types of information that people are already essentially drawing on? And so the wonderful thing is, a dialogue informed by a brief means that the brief lays out the evidence, so people can't make bold assertions about optimal ways of moving forward that aren't based in the evidence. So it creates a level playing field. And the brief also helps to frame the issue in terms of what's our best understanding of the problem, what are some viable options, what are implementation considerations. But then the dialogue itself is kind of a free-for-all about, well, have we really got the problem right? And some of the dialogues we've seen have led people to realize, no, we've actually framed the problem wrong. And then it allows people to talk through the options and say, well, yeah, you know, we might have slightly stronger evidence from that, but in our context, for these very clear reasons, maybe that's not the way to go. And then similarly on the implementation side, you know, in theory something might work a particular way, but a rollout in a country might have been shown to have been ineffective if it used a particular strategy before, so maybe a new one's warranted in this situation. In terms of the evolution in our thinking, I think, you know, we've now got so many of these teams doing dialogues that the variation and the reason for that variation are fascinating. So we have people who are convening dialogues that might have 40 or 50 people, which is very hard to have a conversation. So their solution to that is they feel they need the 50 because that's the array of stakeholders and policymakers who will be involved and are affected by a decision. But then they have working groups that work on pieces of the issue over the day, and then they come back and then they hear where one another is, and then they come to some shared understanding at the group level. And then we have others who are operating dialogues with 15 to 18 people where the group can stay together over the day. So the more that we learn about why people are making these different decisions, then the more helpful I think we can be in future, saying to people, well, if that's your context, then you might want to consider these ways of organizing the dialogue. So the advice would just be, make sure that you've got an evidence brief that will inform the dialogue, that is, you've done enough road testing of it that it's likely to frame the problem in a way that they'll find acceptable, and there are options that are in play that are feasible in your country. But if you've done that work, then a huge piece of the challenge is identifying the right people to be in the right people to be in the room. So what's the array of policymakers, stakeholders, and researchers that you need to have there? That often means a very comprehensive stakeholder mapping exercise to try and figure out who's involved, and then the selecting of the people who will bring unique perspectives to the table and that will champion change after the dialogue. So who's in the room is absolutely critical. Facilitation is essential. I think more and more we realize that the person at the front of the room sends such important signals about the need to listen carefully to one another, to try and build on one another's comments, to respectfully point out disagreements, but to constructively try and identify shared ground, to try and elicit comments from quiet people, to try and figure out, are you being quiet because you're frustrated with the process, or is there something that we can do to better engage you in this? Another thing, though, that we've learned over time is the dialogue in and of itself is not going to do anything unless there's very concerted effort to follow up on it. So most of the teams have a dedicated section at the end of a dialogue that's focused on next steps, where they try and identify or get people to identify what next steps they and their organizations, but especially groups of individuals that are at the dialogue, and if possible, everyone, but certainly groups, what tangible next steps can be done. And then the key issue is what kind of follow-up makes sense. In some countries, it might make sense to link this directly into a technical review group that already exists, that the ministry's already endorsed. In other situations, it might be clear that it's ultimately the ministry that's going to have to make a decision, and a personalized briefing to the top folks within government might make sense. In other times, it might be the Ministry of Finance. Sometimes an NGO might be known to be particularly influential on the issue, and the follow-up activities have to be about getting them on board to do the follow-up. So that follow-up is essential. The dialogue can put in place a lot of the right conditions for success, but those next steps are going to be critical in bringing home the change.